Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrywka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. She asks the plants for permission before foraging them. She sings to her fermentation jars. She prepares funerals for her kombucha scobies. She gives names for her ferments. She observes the moon cycles. She's a witch. But what does it mean to be a witch today? I asked this to Paulina Gretkierewicz, a forager, a fermenter, and a witch. She transforms seasons and landscapes around Copenhagen, Denmark, into edible and drinkable experiences. She calls this applied poetry, which is also the name of her business, focused largely on handpicked, fermented, and oxidized teas. On this episode, apart from our conversation, you will also hear snippets from our Ferment Radio Presents workshop series, in which Paulina guided us to prepare different teas from wild plants. Putting Ferment Radio conversations into practice was actually a long-term dream which now come true. But now, let's ferment our way into becoming a witch.
When I started working with the things I'm working with, especially in Copenhagen with the food business and hospitality and people who actually would be paying me money for what I'm doing as a job. So I would say, I'm let's say foraging, and I specialize in herbal tea. But if somebody who I wasn't really working with, it was more like a social engagement, and I would tell people that I was a witch. In the very beginning, I tried to kind of hide it a little bit, not because I was ashamed. I just was afraid that people would label me in their head for what I'm doing, and then kind of forget about the complexity of that. And it's funny because right now, the people I work with, they kind of themselves lead with the witch part. So it became something in the beginning that I had to kind of cover it up. And not because I was ashamed. It was just I was afraid that people have this idea that if I am a witch collecting plants, that I mostly focus on this medicinal part of it and the whole ritualistic part of this, which is also very true. But most of my work is actually concentrated around flavor, creating something that is not necessarily consumable only for people who are into witchcraft, I would say. So I didn't want to be kind of put into one drawer, and then because of that, it would be just hard to get out of it in a way.
I actually, when you said that this is how you would or you are introducing yourself, depending on the context, how usually people react?
I think that most of the people laugh because they think it's funny. They think I'm actually joking. When I tell them, I'm a witch, I do stuff with plants, and they think, haha, it's hilarious because you're from Poland and so you're just doing the plant stuff. So right now they think it's funny. I work with people who right now tell people, our forager is a witch, which is awesome. She has this relationship with nature, and it's about sustainability and kind of very this spiritual approach to environment, which became very much aligned with the whole concept of environmentalism and sustainability and respect towards the things you're working with. And I was afraid that they will judge me in the sense of that I don't think the flavor part, especially in this restaurant business that I'm working with, right, that I'm not focusing enough about this. And it's nice that I have a story about how I respect nature, and I tell people that I mostly collaborate with plants, that I don't use plants in my practice, that I collaborate with things. And now it became an advantage towards this, that they have this romantic framing, and there is the storytelling towards this, that not only our foragers doing stuff because of the flavor part, or we get tea from this woman who cares about stuff, but it's also and for that she's a witch. I don't want to say that maybe they're like romanticizing it, but a little bit.
Yeah, there is more to that
than just like, oh, she picks the plants and then we get the plants and the end, you know. So now it's funny because that just became my advantage. It was something that I thought is gonna be in the way of people taking me seriously, I guess, in this business, you know. And now it became very much like an advantage. So now I tell people I'm a witch.
Do you remember like your first realization, hey, I am a witch? Or do you remember when you used this word for the first time to describe yourself?
Yeah, I do, because it very much kind of started with the fermentation, actually, for me. That when I was writing my bachelor thesis in Copenhagen, I was writing about fermentation and beer and women, basically. So for my bachelor project, I actually brewed a beer at the brewery and wrote very much about how did it happen that the beverage that was very much invented by women. It was like, historically speaking, women were in charge of brewing and fermenting, especially beer, because just simply of like, this was something that happened in the kitchen at home. And then it turned into this like very masculine thing that we think about, with like those rigid rules about what is real beer and how hoppy it has to be and who's really drinking it, you know. And then you would go to the bar and like order something that was sour and they'll be like, oh, it's a lady drink or something, you know. So I was writing basically a bachelor's about it. And when I started researching this, I realized that that is kind of the word to describe myself, like the relationship that I had with fermentation and how my approach to the creatures that I collaborated with. I also was always insisting to tell them like, oh, this is my yeast and I collaborate with those yeast. This is not something I just like find or pitch or whatever. So I realized that also that word was very much kind of like a powerful word, you know, and that it was describing what I was feeling and describing what I was doing. And yeah, it was like a part of the journey to like not even like start calling myself this. It wasn't like, oh, now I'm gonna do the witch thing. It was just like, oh, that's what I do.
You found a description of yourself.
Yeah, and then, you know, obviously when this started happening and I kind of started digging deeper into it, it just started making a lot of sense to me, like the historically speaking, and also from my family point of view, because like my father's mother, my grandma, and my dad always told me that grandma was super witchy. So she was doing all sorts of weird things. My mom also always tells me stories about how grandma gave her beetroot juice through her entire pregnancy and did some weird witchcrafty stuff about it. And so when I started digging up into it, I was like, this is the word, you know. And I also in the beginning, I thought it was fun that I told people I was a witch, and especially in Denmark, because that's when I kind of started doing this, right? After studying anthropology, and they were all like, oh, you silly goose, like what does it mean, you know? But it was very much about the whole acknowledging of their relationship with things around you, because I worked with brewers and they were all very much about, this is the rules, this is how you do things. And for me, it was more like discovering the relationship that you have with those creatures that live around you and all over the place, not only when you start fermenting, but like just generally speaking, you know, like when you start wondering about how you approach the world, and I guess that word also. But yeah, so, and I liked the label because it kind of challenged a lot of stuff, especially in academia when I was doing this. And I was telling people, well, I'm writing about witches because I believe I am a witch. And that was very much about, relationships, and not so much about like dancing in the moon, which I also do, but it was very much more about like acknowledging the aliveness of everything around you. Like the things are from like a very, I guess, animistic point of view. And a lot of this was also me explaining to people that even if I didn't, which I do, didn't believe that like, you know, any of this is doing anything, the witchcraft that people think I actually do and believe in, like, oh, if I do this spell, something will happen. It was more like trying to acknowledge that everything around you is a part of the whole. So I also tell this to people, especially with foraging. When I go to the forest, I quite literally ask plants for permission. And even if I didn't believe that they can hear me in some way, I think this is more like doing Jedi mind tricks on yourself a little bit, because then you're like acknowledging that the other thing you're working with is not just like an object you show up and collect, right? It's like there is a relationship happening. There is like maybe like it's a wrong word to call something like this personhood, but almost, right? Because if you just show up to the forest and be like, here is a grocery shop, I can just pick stuff for free and go home. But when you go there and you acknowledge that this other thing that you're working with is also like, has this idea of personhood. It's not just a thing for you to grab. I think you are teaching yourself very much respect towards that. And then you're like, okay, I don't come here. Those are not things. Those are, well, for lack of a better word, like persons, you know, like non-human beings that have agency and value, and I'm not better than them or anything. And also, like, I think that part of this was also that the being a witch became kind of like a very pop thing about feminism and stuff. And like now everybody was a witch because like, oh, if you do something contradictory, and part of me was a little mad about it, not because I don't think that is like a good framework, but I think that also like robs a lot of people who are like indigenous people and stuff, that the witchcraft not for everybody is just a metaphor for like a powerful womanhood, you know, or like feminism or something. It was very much, well, some people actually do real witchcraft, and it's not a metaphor. It's like people believe that this is like the way to do stuff. And there is this animistic idea of like beings around you have agency as much as you do. Just because you think you're more important doesn't make you so.
Something which came to my mind when you were describing how you ask for the permission, the plants you are foraging, it's also like, I think if you acknowledge another being, whether it's human or grass, I think you create the relationship. I think relationship cannot happen if you do not acknowledge, okay, here you are. This is how it starts. And I don't think it's given. I think that relationships, they need to start from acknowledgement.
Yes. Like, I mean, there is like this idea of like reciprocity in like a very real, tangible way. That if you don't say a lot of things out loud, that's very much like a spell. Do things with words. That's what, there is like a basic understanding of what witchcraft is changing reality with words, right? So if you say something into being, it's going to be a thing. And I think that is changing your idea in your head of what the world around you is. So that's the whole asking for permission and creating this, like you say.
Do you think that, or at least from your practice and experience, do you have something similar when working with microbes, when you do work with them in fermentation?
And I think it's funny to me because I sometimes talk to people about this, and I am like very particular about my creatures. And I like do a lot of things with them that are kind of similar things that other people do, but like I kind of put them into this framework of like making them into the things that I have this almost like a friendly relationship. So like when I do work with, let's say, because I do a lot of wild brewing in a sense of, obviously I also have an experience with kombucha and water kefir, but my favorite work is with like bringing microbes home from the plants. And that is like a beautiful thing that a lot of people don't understand. That's like you can go to the forest and pick some berries, bring them home, and if you put them in the sugar water, they're going to ferment that sugar water, right? There's like this yeast living everywhere.
Right.
On everything. And then I would quite literally do this thing when I would like hug my jars and dance with them around the kitchen and sing to them and stuff, you know? So it is very much like, and I'm also very particular about discarding anything that's alive. So if I work with kombucha, I literally just had my SCOBY die because I was away from home and it was like super warm. Nobody was there to take it. And I literally almost was thinking I have to do like a funeral for this because I was so hurt about this. And sometimes I talk with people and they're like, oh yeah, if I have too much water grains, I just discard them. I just throw them in the garbage. And like my heart just stops because I'm like, what do you mean you do that? Because for me, it's like, you brought those things home, you fed them, you created this relationship with them. And for me, it's almost like, well, for like having an animal, because it is kind of similar. It's just like a different kind of creature, right?
Yeah, I totally get you. But so what do you do with your exes?
I do with my ex. I will do weird witch stuff with them. I'll like bury them in different places.
Oh, really?
Like, insist of like giving them to people. I constantly push stuff on people, or I would just eat them. Because just throwing it in the garbage, it just feels wrong. And I'm not saying that everybody should stop. It's just like because of how much I put into this, it would just feel wrong to throw it out a little bit.
I understand. I also like my kombucha hotel is like super full, and whenever I have opportunity, I want to give it away. Like I also try to avoid it. Like sure, I managed to like throw away ferments, but I know the feeling. It's a terrible feeling. Like you don't want to do it.
And it's also like funny because then I'm just like, I had like something that goes multi. I work sometimes also with kvass, the Polish kvass. And depending how you do this, like the beetroot thing, half of the time it goes multi. I like have a terrible record with this. And so part of me is kind of butthurt that I'm like, first of all, I'm failing as a Polish lady, I'm failing as a witch. How can I not ferment kvass properly? You know, it's in my blood. It's the beetroot thing. And then it goes multi, and I'm like, well, but then there's this other creature that lives there, you know, like, and comes there, and it's not the creature I invited, but mold is still kind of like a fluffy representation of like, it did something wrong or didn't pay enough attention. And then I also think of my mom who would just like scoop the mold on and be like, let it ferment later, you know, because it's like, you're not going to die. So in this sense, yeah, I don't know. I also just make it a thing in a way, not to like throw things out. Like, I guess I just grow to like live with a lot of those things. So I give them away and stuff. Yeah. And right now I also work with kefir. I know I'm going to come back home and it's going to be so over fermented. So I'm already like been yesterday thinking maybe I should like call people who like help me out with like making sure it's all right. I don't know. It's like arrangement when I have to leave for longer than a day or two. I have to like make sure my ferments are taken care of, you know. So yeah, I don't throw them out. I do a lot of fermentation, and I give names to some of my ferments too. Like it's kind of.
Can you say any? Do you remember?
Well, I remember stuff, but like it's like Polish old grandma names. You know?
Oh, tell me, I love that stuff.
I don't know. There's like one ferment I called Bożena. I don't know. I found the Bożena. It's like such a Polish name, and yeah, I mean we work this together. It's also funny because like, when you work with fermentation and also talk about it to people, I think a lot of people do this when you start really getting obsessed and you start wondering like, where do you end and when the ferment starts? Like a lot of people think that because I care a lot about my ferments that I am very gentle with them, which is absolutely not the case. Like I handle everything with my bare hands. Like I'm very allergic to people using gloves if there is no need for it, because there is like need for sometimes for gloving yourself if you like have a cut on your hands or something. But I strongly believe in this like tactile experience of like being together in the touching kind of sense. So like I sometimes wonder about like where do I end and where the ferment starts, because obviously there's all sorts of bacteria living on top of us. Like there's more of it than us. So then when you have this relationship, so I sometimes wonder, you know, when you keep touching something and there is like a little bit of the same on both of you. Like obviously this is something that a lot of people wonder about, this whole like hand imprint on your ferments. But I wonder about this sometimes. And also then you end up drinking it and eating it, and a lot of that thing becomes, so like I am interested in this kind of relationship of like, and that's why I think I give them names, because I'm like, there has to be some kind of It's almost like a friendship in a way, you know? Yeah, you wouldn't like kick your friend out, like just throw them in the garbage. You have to like get them out somewhere respectful, you know? And I think that's also extending to the plants. That's where all this like asking for permission and like kind of acknowledging that what I'm doing. And I often tell people, they're like, oh, but what do you do? Then plants say no and you don't pick. And I'm like, yeah. Sometimes I will go to the forest and be like, this doesn't feel right.
Does it happen that you ask for permission and something tells you, no, this is not a good
thing? It happens. Like I had to say no to people. I had like, when I work with people who like ask me for picking something, I'll go place and I would like sit there and be like, oh, and I just feel like it's not right to do. And then I would just say, no, I guess not. And I will teach this to people to be like, even if you don't believe that this is literally the plants responding to you, if you go somewhere and ask for permission and the first thing that pops in your brain is like, this feels wrong, it's probably wrong. Like it's your gut instinct, which is like all the information you have. There is something that makes it seem like you shouldn't be doing it. If your gut instinct says no, it's probably from information you collected around. It's like maybe this plant is too rare, or you know it's growing somewhere that you shouldn't be, or you don't want to show it to people because you know it kind of people are going to show up and destroy it, you know? So I try to kind of do this. And again, gut instinct is very much related to the microbial thing. So then like you kind of go deep into this, like, who's talking? Is this all the microbes I have a relationship? Is it all the plants with the yeast that I eat or touch or whatever?
I never thought about this like a gut feeling, that it's like a microbe sending you a message, like a signaling something. I think this perspective is so cool.
I mean, like it's all about storytelling, right? And then it's like you could probably find a scientific research into that it possibly is true in a way. Like, you know, now we know that there is brain-gut connection, and like somehow it's very important that our gut health is balanced so we don't get depressed and stuff. There is more research happening into this, but like...
I think it also boils down to this, that maybe sometimes it doesn't matter why, but the only things that which matters is that there is a strong feeling that no or yes, and that's it. Like understanding why it happens, so I don't think it will really change if you think something badly, you know, like as a sensory thing.
And like you say, it doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter if there is scientific research into it. It's like an information that comes from the feeling inside of you. And I think that is very important feedback to feed into the stuff.
Yeah, totally. It's such a universe, and I think that I deliberately don't want to ask you for a definition of witch, because I have a feeling that there is so many ways to tap into it. But something which I really feel strongly about, that it's a very big universe of like knowledge. Like I experienced it yesterday when you were running the workshop, which maybe we can soon talk a little bit about. That you really like just spit information like tung, 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 you know, there's so many things. Like, how do you learn about this stuff?
So we have the fireweed, which is this plant. It's called willow herb in some languages, or fireweed. I do not know how this is called in Finnish. I apologize for that. But this plant originally is actually used for that process. So from depending where, like Eastern Europe, actually parts of Russia, they call this even chai and stuff. So it's like the process that originated because the tea plant, the tea itself was a little too expensive. So people were trying to supplement the process with using the herbs that were actually local. So this process that you would usually treat the tea plant, actual tea plant with, we are going to try to apply to like a local plants. I also just want to say that just because a fruit of the plant is edible does not mean that the leaves are also going to be edible. So if you're going to go out and look for some plants, please make sure that the actual leaf is also edible. Google things, because there is a lot of plants that it will apply. So like blackberries, raspberries, all those plants, leaves are edible. But then there is, for example, like elderflower, and you can eat the flowers, you can eat berries, but the leaves are not edible. Another disclaimer that is kind of the opposite of what I just said to you is just because some people told you something is poisonous doesn't mean it's true. So you learned by observing other people do. So when people ask me, oh, where did you learn about those plants and how do you know all those things? I'm like, I don't know. I was around people who used to do it. Like, how do I know how to make like Polish pickled cucumbers, you know? Like, how do you like to ferment stuff? And I don't know. I just kind of learned by osmosis in a way, like being around my mother, you know? And it's still the same way, because I would call my mom. Now I have difficulties with this because like I want to write down recipes and to be able to explain them to other people. So I would call my mother and be like, Mom, what is the actual recipe? And then be like, put water, put salt, how much salt? Until it feels right. That is also something I believe when I tell people about fermentation or making tea, that I don't have like a strict recipe. I think that you should use your body as an apparatus to kind of measure things. First, because I believe that you will taste something and like something differently than I would like. So I can give you a recipe, but like whatever you tweak it your way, it's going to be better. And I also think that you learn better by experiencing things than just having a recipe. You could have a recipe and like, you know, follow step by step and some things go wrong and you're not going to know how to fix it. But if you know how things are supposed to smell and feel and taste, you're going to, even with the recipe, you're going to change the recipe. Something is going to come out of it that feels right. It's just, being around things and trying them out. And I think that is the thing that people don't realize, that they think that I just came up with something that already is perfect, but like I failed a million times on the way. And now I know that this failure was kind of part of the experience, right? People be like, oh, how do you know how to do it? And like, I did it wrong 100 times. And now I know what happens if you do it wrong.
But talking about learning and like inspirations, you mentioned this braiding sweetgrass book. Do you remember any other book which was like impactful on?
I read the Donna Haraway Cyborg Manifesto, and that inspired me quite a lot, especially the whole conversation about like your relationship to the past and relationship to the future. That she has this entire idea of like that we're all kind of have to embrace this cyborgism because we have like all sorts of contradictive parts towards us, and we have to live in the world when we can like create this weird monstrosity of different chunks, you know. She talks at some point about like a salamander, that when you lose your tail as a salamander, the tail that will grow out back is going to be weird and kind of crooked. It's not going to be a perfect tail, but it is kind of what is happening right now, right? We like have to kind of shed a lot of things that we used to believe in, especially living in a world of climate change and like fighting colonial approach to things and stuff. It's like the thing that will come out of it is going to be kind of weird. Like she talks a lot about that. We're all like the daughters of patriarchy. We're like rooted into it, and we're trying to like grow into something that is out of it, but like it's really impossible. So you kind of have to acknowledge your place in life. This is what I've been socialized into, but I want to create a total different world. But this new world we are creating is going to be kind of weird. And
because it's also made of past partially and pretending that there's no disconnection.
Yeah, and also like you cannot be just like purist in any kind of form. Like we're like creatures of like academia and also science and also this like weird natural world. Like we cannot separate those things from each other. They're all gonna be kind of together, you know? Judy Butler's Gender Trouble was something that like opened my mind into, you think one thing, but like somebody will say something that will change the way you look at things forever. You know, something that you took for granted. Beer is made out of yeast, and yeast is just a thing that you drop in your ferment and they make beer in the end, you know? And don't question stuff. Or like all bacteria is bad. You know, we have those conversations, especially around COVID, also like that you have to like wash your hands because all those microbes, the viruses, they will kill you. But it's like absolutely not true. Like we cannot live in a sterile world because that is also really bad for us, you know? So there should be less of this like why, and show me the facts and more about, does this work for you? You know, because we've done a lot of this, like dismantling, being like, factually speaking, this is the thing, and right. The thing, we do a lot of that, and what is like valuable information also, because you know, you can talk to some women who do fermenting, they've been doing this for generations, like my mom, you know, and she has no idea about like percentage wise how is her salt solution, or what is the actual microbial colony that grows in her sauerkraut. The lady knows how to make sauerkraut. She's like, you ferment it this way, you drop salt and then it like, does it make her sauerkraut worse than some man who is doing it in the lab? No, it doesn't.
But I think that like it's also about owning, because I think when you describe things in a way, you start to own them. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think it's a lot about it, because coming back to the sauerkraut, no, it's like people did it for hundreds or thousands of years even. Yeah. And then suddenly somebody comes, describe it, you know, in a scientific way, or like very proper with all the percentages and whatever species of yeast and bacteria which live there. And it somehow becomes, okay, this person invented it.
Like I make a blackberry beer every year, which is a wild blackberry beer. And I have this conversation with people who are brewers, and they tell to me, well, we cannot really do this because every year you make this beer is going to be a different beer. This is wild yeast. This doesn't have repetitiveness to it. We cannot have the same thing that comes out of this every year. And I'm like, how is that a bad thing? That your ferment every year, you catch different yeast, you catch different stuff. It's going to ferment a little differently. It's going to taste differently. Everybody in this room at some point swallow an apple seed and didn't die. Apple seeds contain cyanide, the same trace amount of cyanide that some of the leaves would contain. So let's say the point of contention always is cherry leaves, because they are the ones that contain the most cyanide comparing to actual seeds. So I would very much discourage everybody in this room from trying to ferment cherry leaves, just because I don't want to have you on my conscience if you die. But also the difference between the poison and something edible is usually the amount of eating something. So again, like cinnamon, if you eat too much of it, you will die. Coumarin, the substance that makes cinnamon smell like cinnamon, is considered toxic component. But obviously we don't eat cinnamon with spoonfuls. We sprinkle it on top of the cake, and in this form is perfectly edible. So for example, I work with apple leaves, and a lot of Danish government kind of has a problem with that because they considered apple leaves kind of poisonous, which I disagree with, but that is my opinion.
Hey, by the way, when you said that you are making like a wild crafted beer, how do you know that you are making beer and not wine?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
I just call it beer because...
So you just let it ferment and
Yes.
let's see what happens.
I mean, you know, and again, depends who you ask. Like, I have those conversations with other of my friends who do wild ferments, and like, I would, especially because I come from the craft beer industry, and people have opinions, you know, especially people from the countries like Germany, for example. So it's like a profanity to say that what I do with my wild blackberries, mixing them with water and honey or sugar and then turning them into something fermented, and I call it beer because, I mean, it's like about 5% alcohol, it's sparkly.
And how long do you let them ferment?
Well, anything from 24 hours to like 2 weeks, depends how I feel fancy, you know, what I'm trying to approach. So sometimes some people will call it soda, some people will call it beer. A lot of people who do what I do, they just call them ferments because they don't want to argue with people who have opinions, and I agree with that. Because if you ask a German who is brewing beer if what I'm doing is beer, they will absolutely disagree that what I'm doing is beer. It's not beer. So for me, I call it beer just because, historically speaking,
this is how it worked.
Beer was not made only with grain and hops. Historically speaking, beer was just a ferment that happened putting herbs into alcoholic kind of beverage, right? So we started out with other herbs and stuff. Then the rules come in, then the hops come in, then all sorts of industrial approach to things happen. But beer have not always just been hops and grains. I call it beer because I guess I want to be provocative, because I also am tired of this like narrative of like men being...
Also owning the name, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, this is what we do is beer, but this what you do is not beer.
And I tell them, well, historically speaking, I am kind of more right than you. And for a longer period of time, in a way, you know what I mean? Because beer used to be a consistency of oatmeal that you had to drink through a straw because that's what happens. You fermented grains and stuff, but yeah, I don't need to argue. I also don't need this to be beer. That for me is ferment, right? Like, so I guess that's the thing. Yeah.
Actually, like now I am thinking like how actually I found you was through Instagram, and something that I've been really drawn into is that you like just post the stories that you hang out somewhere in the forest, some bushes, some grass, and just picking stuff. Oh, look at this, a nice plant. And it's just in a way repetitive, but there is something great about this repetition. Mm-hmm. Like I am like, okay, let's see what's up there today, you know? Yeah. And how is your day? Because I also think that like you forage a lot. Like I judge just from the Instagram, you are out there like every day, but you work with stuff which is so highly cyclical. Mm-hmm. Like it has seasons regarding like foraging wild plants, but also you have ferments at home which have their own little cycle. Yeah. How do you deal with that? Like, do you have some routine or ritual around it, or it's more like whatever feels like being done, I am going for it?
My day is like, I guess anybody else's day. I wake up, I check on my ferments in a way, like, you know, whatever I'm fermenting right now, I wake up, I like shake some things. Right now I'm like making a lot of like sugar syrups that are basically just covering fruit with syrup. So I have to check on that if it's not molting. Like you gotta literally open your jars and be like, what's up, what's here, you know? And then I just leave. Like sometimes I have a plan, because right now the nature of my work is that I work with a lot of people who have expectations of what I'm supposed to bring them. Mm-hmm. So some places are like, I owe them, let's say, we know that this year before the season for plants ends, I need to deliver, let's say, 5 kilo of this specific plants to you until like from March, then let's say September, I have time for some of the breweries and I'll be like, okay, from this, you need like 5 kilo of dry produce from me, which means that it's about 100 kilos of plants sometimes, the fresh ones.
Right.
Which means that I cannot just do it within a week. I'm also like one person. So I have to like incorporate that into my day. But a lot of my thing is just getting out there and wondering what's growing. You know, it's like a lot of the tea I'm making, also the tea that I'm offering to people, not that they order from me in some specific way. It's just me going and seeing what actually is out there and it's good, which is random and sometimes frustrating because there's days when I go and I find nothing that is worth actually picking. But then there's days when I find way too much and, you know, and I always talk about this with my other friends who are foragers, that like people think that we just like, you know, you dressed in this like princess fairy dress in the forest, you ran around barefoot and smell flowers all day. But the truth about your work is that it's a hard work. Like you go, you get eaten by bugs, you get ticks on you, you get scratched, you have to get into some nasty bush to like find things. Like, you know, in the spring when I forage violets, like a lot of my time I spend like literally crawling under bushes and like getting my hair ripped out of my head. You know? I mean, it's very much related to the ferments because a lot of the time my ferments end up being ferments because I don't know what to do with my stuff. So I'll pick like 10 kilos of blackberries and I'm like, God damn, I have to like deal with this somehow. Like maybe nobody want to buy it off of me or something. And then I'm like, well, I guess I'm making beer now with blackberries and whatever herbs I have left over, you know. So a lot of my work is quite literally dependent of what's happening outside and what I find and dictated by this. And rituals, I have a lot of rituals. I mean, I very much am influenced by the moon and the moon phases and what's happening. And I also try to do a lot of things consciously and write them down for archiving reasons, but also for my own reasons to do a lot of things mindfully. So like I do a lot of stuff according to the moon, like winemakers and witches, we have a lot in common. Like we also talked about this biodynamic wine. The people who care about full moon is witches and natural winemakers. Because there is a reason and order to that. So.
But do you do your ferments, for example, or even tea with an intention in a way?
Okay. I always do that. I try also not to ferment anything when I'm in really bad mood because I strongly believe that does affect the way things taste. And so I try when I go foraging, and that also goes back to like asking for permission. Because I try to go there and not to just like, oh, I have to do this, I have to pick it, and then you're frustratingly picking something and being mad about it or just don't really feel it. I try to kind of center myself back to it. And I think that the asking for permission is a little bit like sliding into this mindset of like, I have to be grateful. I don't need anything. I don't need an investment. I don't need to buy anything. I can literally just take a knife and a bag from my kitchen and go to the forest and find some things that are like just there for free to grab. The only thing that you need is like to know how not to get poisoned.
You are now like got more specialized in tea. I have a feeling that it's like quite dominant part of your practice. Can you ever get bored by drinking wild tea?
No, I don't think there's a limit to this. Also to like, it's the same with like the process of this enzymatic oxidation that I kind of make my tea. The way I make my tea is like there's like unlimited amount of options, especially with plants. Like you can research plants your own life and your whole of your life and not come up with like the end point. And also you can use it in fermenting because that's also where I think it's interesting. Like make a tea and then add some yeast to this and then ferment that. Because then it's what are you drinking?
You do it too.
Yeah. Are you drinking beer? Are you drinking tea that's fermented? What is happening, you know? And I think that is my favorite part of this because you like, yeah, when you brew, I talk about this a lot with the people that I work with that like just make the tea out of this and add some fruit that's wild and then ferment that and see what happens with it. So a lot of my experiments is a little bit marrying all those things together.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you got more into tea, and the whole universe opened. It didn't narrow it down at all.
No. And people think this like, oh, aren't you like limiting yourself? And I'm like, no, there's no limits to what I can do. You know, you can use it in cooking, you can use it in brewing, you can use it in, I don't know, even like in cosmetic stuff. Like I tell this to people, it's like sometimes I just like put my tea in like spray bottle and like spray it on my hair, and that's the thing, right? It's like, the sky is the limit of like what you can do with things.
That's right. Thank you for listening to this episode, but also for wilting, hand rolling, crowding, and fermenting wild plants on this Ferment Radio Presents workshop with Paulina, which took place during Helsinki's Night of the Arts at Solu Space in Helsinki, Finland, and was supported by BioArt Society. If you like this episode, please share it. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. We would love to know what you thought of this conversation, hear your human microbial stories, and your suggestions for the future episodes. We are always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. You can also leave us an audio message by connecting to us on our Instagram. Ferment Radio is brought to you by Super Eclectic, and it's supported by Microbial Lives, Practices of New Human Microbial Cultures, a project at the Center for the Social Study of Microbes. I'm very grateful for this support, and most of all with all our amazing Ferment Radio listeners. Keep fermenting and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.